Okay, it looks like we still have a few more people coming in, but I am going to start. My name is Seth Mnookin. I'm the director of MIT's graduate program in science writing. And I am here today because we are doing a AAAS and Kavli Foundation talk in honor of the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards. This is part of their lecture series. The awards program has been running continuously since 1945. And if people are interested in learning more about it, you can go to sjawards.AAAS.org. So SJ is in science journalism, awards.AAAS.org. If anyone is interested in learning more about MIT's graduate program in science writing, you can go to SciWrite, SCIWRITE.MIT.edu. And we do not turn people away because of lack of funding. It is my delight and joy to be here welcoming Helen Branswell, whose work I have known for a long time, and who I have known for, I guess, a little more than a half decade. Helen is a senior writer at STAT, covering infectious diseases and global health, two subjects which have actually been in the news a little bit recently. She joined STAT at its outset. She was one of the people that was hired to help show that STAT was really serious about what it was doing. And she has certainly shown that. She's led STAT's COVID-19 coverage. She won the 2020 George Polk Award for public service for that coverage, and was recently awarded the 2021 Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting, which is one of the highest honors in our field. This talk is also in honor of Sharon Begley, who is actually a former colleague of both Helen and mine, me from Newsweek and Helen from STAT. Sharon very tragically passed earlier this year and had been scheduled to give one of the AAAS lectures. For anyone who doesn't know Sharon, she was one of the most remarkable journalists of our generation. From the moment she graduated from college, she was working as a science journalist, which is a rare feat. Her list of awards is longer than most people's resumes. She was the author of 6 books, including most recently Can't Just Stop, but a lot of other great books. And she was one of the other people that was hired in 2015, right when STAT was starting. And so, yeah, this is in honor of Sharon, who is certainly missed in our field. So Helen, I actually wanted to use that as a segue to ask you about your career a little bit. As I said, Sharon, in her college yearbook, wrote that what she wanted to do was be a science journalist. That is certainly not the path that most people take. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went into science journalism?
By fluke, not design. Yeah, no, I mean, Sharon, for me, it was quite unique when I met her to discover that somebody could have started as a science journalist from the very beginning and stayed in the field. I come from what we used to call print journalism background. I worked for a newspaper and then for Canada's equivalent of Associated Press, the Canadian Press, and I covered lots of different things for, close to 2 decades. I covered politics. I covered school boards at a point. I covered all sorts of different things. And at a point, I was a foreign correspondent for the Canadian Press. And it was a term position. I'd had 5 years in London as CP's European correspondent. And when it was time for me to move back to Canada, they sort of said, what do you want to do? And I named a couple of jobs that I thought would be fun to do. And they said, well, we'd really like you to be a health reporter. And I was like, oh, I'm not really interested in that at all. And they were like, well, we'd really like you to do it. And it became apparent fairly quickly that it was the best job on offer at the time. So I started it without any background at all. And, I found the first few years quite nerve-wracking, trying to learn how to get the journals in advance. CP wasn't getting advanced, embargoed copies of journals. So I was constantly waking up and finding out everybody had a story I didn't know about. Figured that one out fairly quickly, but, learning how to read a study, learning what mattered, what didn't. I mean, it all took time, and it was really the steepest learning curve I've ever been on as a journalist.
And before I ask you another question, speaking of questions, we will have an audience Q&A portion of the talk. So if you look to the bottom of your screens, I believe all the way to the right before the big red leave button, there's a Q&A button. So please put your questions, any questions you have there, you can start putting them there now, and we will get to as many of those as we can towards the end of this session. So Helen, so you say it was an incredibly steep learning curve. I know in most beats, I've also worked in a lot of different beats. In most beats, a big part of the learning curve is sources and figuring out who you can trust. And in science, it's sort of sources plus all of the sources' background in their work. And it sounds like there wasn't someone where you were who could sort of hold your hand through this. So how did you go about that?
Wow, trial and error, I guess. Initially I didn't know what I didn't know, so today if somebody were asking me, one of your students were asking me, so how do I find somebody? I would probably suggest taking a stroll through PubMed and looking for people who had published on the same topic as a way of finding somebody to talk to, or asking people you trust, either other journalists or other academics, who's good on X. Back then, I probably didn't know about PubMed. So, it was really sort of reaching out. I was probably a lot more reliant then on the press officers of hospitals and universities, in Toronto, and then more broadly in, Canada. As I got more accustomed to the beat, I would start to, realize, oh, X university is really good on hypertension, or, trying to find out where the areas of expertise were situated and going there.
One of the really interesting, I think, exciting things about covering science is it's a beat in a different way from most beats, in that within science, there are almost an infinite number of beats, as many beats as there are different areas of science. Right. Oftentimes, science reporters are asked to sort of cover everything, or everything that's newsworthy. Now you specialize in infectious diseases. Was there a point that you realized that that was the direction you were heading, or that was something that especially interested you?
Yeah, so when I started in the beat, my predecessor at CP had been called the health reporter, and I didn't want to be called the health reporter because in Canada, health reporters often had to cover health politics and health economics, like sort of the ongoing battle between the federal government in Canada and the provinces about how much money was going to be spent to support the single payer system in Canada. So I called myself, I designated myself the medical reporter to try to steer the focus to sort of medical science and, biomedical research. And then, about 3 years into my tenure, the SARS-1 outbreak happened, and Toronto, where I was living, was one of the places that had a really true outbreak. I mean, many countries had a few cases, but Toronto had the only full-on outbreak outside of Asia, and that was a real, baptism by fire. For me, I didn't really know anything about covering infectious diseases, but it was fascinating, and it was comfortable in a way, if that doesn't sound too odd, because it was a place where my breaking news background met, this sort of body of scientific reporting skill that I was building up. And so I really found, like, this is science as a breaking news story. This feels quite comfortable for me. And after that, I really leaned into that area whenever I could. I couldn't focus on it entirely. I had to write for the whole time I was at Canadian Press. I wrote about a bunch of different things, but whenever I had the time, I wrote about infectious diseases.
And so, and that the SARS-1 outbreak was the early 2000s?
2000, it started in 2002, but the world wasn't aware of it until 2003.
Right, okay. And so and you started covering science in 2000, is that right?
Yeah, mid 2000.
So that was a couple of years into your tenure. For a lot of people who switch between beats, and you talked about how your term as a foreign correspondent was sort of term limited out. A lot of people look at 3 or 5 or 6 years as like a good amount of time to cover a beat and move on. It sounds like that was around the time that you realized that you had found the beat that you wanted to stay in. Is that?
I don't think I thought about it, sort of. I don't really think I sat down and thought, do I want to move on to something else, or is this what I want to do for the rest of my life as a journalist? I just never got bored.
Right.
There was nothing that came along that was anywhere near as interesting as what I was writing about. And I don't feel like the science beat is something that people move off of very much. I might be wrong, but the science writers I know who are sort of older, they've been at it for a long time. It's like a beat that people move into and stay in, I think. And it's, there's just, as you point out, so many realms within this realm. It's impossible to imagine getting bored.
Right. One thing that I think is very interesting and really impressive about both you and Sharon. Sharon, towards not towards the end of her life, all through her career, was working and writing as much as a reporter who just showed up on the job would. There was
Right.
clearly like a hunger to be covering as much as possible. And similarly with you, you've accomplished an amazing number of things. You're sort of the daily reporter for one of the fastest changing stories around. How have you been able to juggle covering something like COVID and also having time to work on projects that might not be a 800-word daily news piece, or look at things in a longer framework?
That's tough. And I wish Sharon were around still so I could ask her for advice on it, to be honest, because as you mentioned, I mean, she was extraordinary in terms of her output. She would come into the office. She was one of the first people in the office, and she'd just come in and put her head down and write every day. And she was one of our most productive reporters. And she, by the time she arrived at Stat, she certainly was at a point in her career where she could have coasted or, held out for the big the big pieces, the showy pieces, the prize winning pieces. And she did a number of those, but she also, you know, wrote dailies, and she just wrote a lot. And then she'd go home and write books in her spare time.
Right.
And I don't understand that capacity. You know, when I am done, I'm exhausted, and you know, writing for fun is not part of my makeup. But in terms of trying to juggle, to your point about trying to juggle both daily hits and sort of bigger pieces, it is a challenge at times. You know, this fall, for instance, has been quite busy. A lot of what I cover with COVID and often with infectious diseases is vaccine development. And I really enjoy that part of the infectious disease beat, but it's been very busy lately.
Yeah.
And
So
it sort of, yeah.
Huh.
And so it kind of gets in the way of being able to do sort of bigger pieces, but having the opportunity to, you know, it's hard to hit a balance with those two things, but it's when you can, it really rejuvenates you, you know, like it's after doing a bunch of daily stuff, you're exhausted, and then you have a chance to sort of dig into something a little longer and talk to a few more people and think about something that isn't, that you don't have to hand to your editor in 5 minutes. And that's, I find, reinvigorating, excuse me.
Right. Yeah, talking about that sort of that always being on breaking stories. There's a great story about Sharon from when she was at Newsweek, actually before I got there, where they were in the midst of moving offices in Manhattan. So everything was boxed up and it was chaos, and she was at her desk typing away and working on a story. Which I know I do not have those powers of concentration to be able to focus on something with that amount of chaos around me.
Yeah, you know, it was really a hallmark of hers because, as you point out, I mean, newsrooms, even when they're not being moved, can be pretty busy places. And her desk was a pretty busy place. I mean, we sat beside one another, and, you know, it was remarkable how often other colleagues would come to ask her advice on things, or, you know, they wanted to bounce idea off her, or ask her if she knew anybody who would be good to talk to about something, or get her take on virtually anything. And
Right.
She was just extraordinarily gracious with her time in that way. Like, you never had the sense that you were putting her out, even though she had been writing 5 seconds earlier, and not everybody would enjoy being interrupted, you know, while they were trying to finish a story. She was quite unique in that way. I think, you know, she had a great ability to focus on what she was writing when she was actually doing that.
One thing, speaking of sort of mentoring, that I want to touch on is when she began covering science in the late 70s, journalism, and especially science journalism, was even more of a male bastion than it is today. And my sense from talking with people is that was true both in the newsroom, but also it could be hard at times for female journalists when dealing with scientists. Scientists did not always treat them with the respect that they would a male colleague. One of the things that was so notable about Sharon's, and when the obituaries were written about her, was how many scientists wanted to speak about how incredible a writer she was, how good a reporter she was. In the time that you've been a science reporter, have you seen the industry become more friendly to female reporters? And are some of those are some of the challenges that Sharon might have needed to face in the 70s and 80s, have those gotten easier, or is that still there?
Um, I think, so I wasn't working in science
Yeah,
reporting at that time, and it's not something I can talk about with any kind of firsthand knowledge, but it is true in general in reporting. It was true in general in reporting back then, and probably more true in some subsections of reporting like science, that newspapers were largely run by men, and foreign correspondents were largely men, and senior editors were largely men, and there has been you know a, a, a big change, I think, in the sort of overall population of journalists working. I think it's mostly now in journalism schools. I think women vastly outweigh men. Yeah, but all that to say, it doesn't surprise me that she would have faced an environment in which most of the people she was working with were men. As to the issue of whether scientists were condescending of
or
women,
are now. I mean, is
yeah,
that over the last couple of decades, have you seen?
I haven't felt that. No, I have felt. I think I started covering this area just around the time when scientists started to understand that talking to the media was part of their job.
Right.
You probably remember the time when a lot of scientists felt it was unseemly to talk to the lay press, that to try to publicize your work in that way was looked down upon by colleagues, and that changed. And I don't know if that's related to funding and the realization that trying to get science out to the public, that there were benefits of that. I'm not really sure, but I do feel like what the change that I saw was more related to that,
Right.
Where before you might have had to work to convince somebody to speak to you, now sometimes you have to fend off people who are really eager to get coverage of their work.
Right. Right. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, thinking back to someone like Carl Sagan, who, when he became a sort of popular translator of science, I think things became much more difficult for him as a scientist. It's interesting that you think that has changed broadly. I guess I would agree that there is an awareness of that. I still do all the time encounter scientists who sort of seem to feel that communicating what they're doing to the public is like a task akin to needing to scrape dog crap off their shoe or something.
Are they the ones who don't get asked to be interviewed?
I don't know. Or they're the ones who are older and have decided that they no longer have to do anything for anyone, and they shouldn't need to deign to waste any of their time, doing anything but thinking their brilliant thoughts.
Well, to each his own, I guess.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm fairly lucky. A lot of the people I end up speaking with are people who have a public health background, or at least a public health bent. They may be like an epidemiologist at Harvard, or an immunologist or whatever, but they understand that their area is feeding into sort of a public health funnel, if you will, and they are much more willing to speak than, well, I just don't run into the problem is finding, sometimes can be whether or not they have the time, but it's not unwillingness to speak.
So going back to when you covered SARS, I'm not sure if this was, and I suspect maybe it was different in Toronto, but that seemed like, at least here, one of several occasions when the world was sort of saying, you need to pay attention to the possibility of a pandemic. We might have escaped a worldwide one now, but we're not going to forever.
Right.
What was your sense of that, and what was your sense of covering infectious diseases in the years after SARS? Is that something that that policymakers and public health officials were paying enough attention to?
So the SARS outbreak was contained fairly quickly. By the summer of 2003, all of the outbreaks were out, and but people weren't certain if it had gotten seeded and was sort of spreading silently, or at a low level and not recognized because it was summer in the northern hemisphere, and maybe not maybe the virus was still there but not really causing people to be sick as previously. Everybody was quite concerned, not everybody, some people were quite concerned that it would come back. I remember, I believe it was The Lancet invited a series of people to submit short articles on whether they thought SARS was coming back or if it had actually been put back in the box, as they were saying at the time.
Right.
And so everybody was watching that. And instead of SARS coming back, what happened in, there was a very bad flu season the following year, and a mismatched flu season. Vaccine didn't work very well. But there was also the emergence of the H5N1 bird flu virus. And it, in January of 2004, I think it was Vietnam originally, and a couple of countries in Southeast Asia started reporting little kids dying, and they discovered it was H5N1 flu, bird flu, and then bird flu just sort of started sweeping through Southeast Asia. Mostly it was killing chickens. It was like a conflagration in poultry flocks, but people were becoming infected, and over time, about 60% of the people who were known to be infected with that virus died from it. So it really caught people's attention, and a lot of people who had been worried about SARS or engaged in the effort to control SARS turned their attention to pandemic flu. There was a lot of fear that H5N1 was going to trigger a pandemic. It had been at that point, 35 years or so, maybe 30-ish at that point, since the last flu pandemic. And, people talk about we're overdue.
Right.
It's not really a thing. Nature isn't on that kind of a schedule, but it was true that, every moment we were closer to the next pandemic, and people were very worried. And there was a lot of work being done on pandemic preparedness. A lot of the work that laid the research that laid the groundwork for the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions in this pandemic, things like social distancing, closing schools, that kind of stuff, that work was all done in that period when people were sort of looking at, we may have a flu pandemic coming, we better get ready.
And before we switch over to talking more about COVID and your coverage of COVID, one hallmark of sort of what's been going on with COVID has been misinformation. That's something I want to get into more in a bit also, but my memory is not very good as to whether that was a similar problem with H5N1 or with SARS, except that my memory is that it was not as much of a problem. I wasn't covering it. So I'm curious as to your perspective.
So with SARS, people who got it were severely ill, and that makes it really hard to dispute that something is a real threat when most of the people who get it end up being severely ill. There were a lot of differences between SARS-1 and SARS-2. That's a key one. Another is that, people were mostly infectious once they had become quite sick. And by that time they were in hospital. And so, you didn't have the kind of community spread that we've seen with this outbreak. But, I don't feel like people thought that was underplayed. In terms of H5N1, that the human cases were initially anyways, all in Southeast Asia. Eventually Turkey had an outbreak, and I believe there were cases in India. And of course, Egypt had a protracted outbreak of cases. But, for the rest of the world, it was something that was over there and of concern, but not something that we had to deal with. So I don't know if, there was much misinformation or disinformation about that. Yeah, I think the threats were different enough that it's not maybe analogous.
Right. Just a reminder again, if people have questions, you can put the questions in the Q&A and we will get to those. We have a couple in there already, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there, and I will pose them to Helen. So moving over to your COVID coverage, looking back March, kind of mid-March, there was that week in mid-March where it sort of seemed like we went from the world being open to absolutely everything being shut down. Mm-hmm. As someone who was covering this back in January, and I assume even in December 2019, what were those first couple of months like as a reporter? Did it seem like this is clearly going to turn into something that the world has never experienced before? Or was it not apparent in those early days where things were heading?
So we published my first piece on it on January 4th of 2020. I first heard that something was going on New Year's Eve of 2019. That was the start for me. And initially it was not clear what this was going to be. The world had managed to, not the entire world, but SARS-1 was snuffed out. That, people figured out how to stop transmission, and they successfully did it, and it didn't spread around the world. In 2012, another coronavirus emerged in the Middle East, MERS, Middle East respiratory syndrome virus. And that has had a different pattern. People occasionally get infected, people who have contact with camels, which are the host of the virus. And sometimes, infected people go into hospitals and there's spread within the hospitals. And there have been some big hospital outbreaks, both in a number of Middle Eastern countries and at one point in South Korea. But that never took off. And I think in the early days, when people realized this was a new coronavirus, I know some of the people I've talked to, people who worry about, infectious disease outbreaks, people who were involved in the SARS-1 outbreak, they thought it would be containable because neither of those two earlier ones had taken off. But it obviously wasn't. And, as January progressed and the numbers started to rise, and then you saw China taking the extraordinary step of quarantining whole cities of tens of millions of people, it was clear this was a big deal. You don't do that. I don't think anybody but China could do that, but it was clear that we were in a dangerous spot. But it was, for me, puzzling then and puzzling still how slowly the rest of the world seemed to come to grips with, that this was not going to go away.
And when you say how slowly the rest of the world came to grips with it, in terms of acknowledging it as a threat, or in terms of starting to implement, things like social distancing, closing schools? Obviously, it was a while before face masks were recommended, but for those type of things, or just a sort of general awareness?
I think getting the public aware, getting the public ready for the fact that life might be about to change. I also, to this day, don't quite understand, what happened within the CDC and the FDA on the testing issue. For instance, I understand that the first test was faulty. Why there wasn't, why that wasn't solved with more haste, I'm still not clear. Why the US didn't move to license the test that Christian Drosten in Germany had designed, that and gave to the World Health Organization, which made it available to all sorts of other countries. I mean, I know normally CDC would develop their own tests. That's what happens. But every minute that the country wasn't testing,
Right.
it was running blind, and that didn't seem to get addressed very quickly. And that, people blame the CDC for that, but it was also the FDA. And it just felt like people weren't acting like this was going to be a problem for us,
And did you have a sense, was that something that was happening in people who had had long careers and worked within the CDC and FDA, or was that something that was happening because the administration was, at the time, the Trump administration was obviously eager to downplay it and seemed to have a hard time accepting the reality of what it was?
I think kind of all of the above, and not just in the United States. I remember I was working in sort of the second half of February of 2020 on a piece sort of looking at, why the virus wasn't behaving outside of China the way it was behaving in China. And I talked to a researcher I know who had attended a WHO meeting. He joked at the time that it was probably the last in-person WHO scientific meeting for quite a while. And he said they had gathered experts from Asia, they'd gathered experts from Europe and from North America, I'm sure South America as well. And he said, the Asians were really, really nervous, like really on edge. But a number of people from Europe really felt that this was not going to come to Europe in a big way and take off in a big way. I think, I don't know that anybody thinks they're going to live through or have to respond to a 100-year event,
Yeah, right. And even, it sounds like from your experience as a reporter, even when they are living through it, it can be hard to accept that that's what's going on.
Yeah, I would have thought that, that you'd know it when you saw it,
Right.
that when something was starting, that you'd know it when you saw it, but it's not that easy, I think.
Well, and that gets to, I have a couple more questions, and then I'm going to switch over to some audience questions. But that gets to one of the two things I wanted to make sure I asked you about before I gave up my virtual microphone. And that's, there have obviously been a huge number of changes, including just the explosion in virtual meetings, events, doing things online like this. This is something that, were we not still in a pandemic, would almost certainly have been in person. Doing scientific meetings, doing conferences general virtually as opposed to traveling. What changes do you think might outlast this pandemic? Slash, Do you think there is such thing as outlasting this pandemic, or given where we are, is this something that we're going to be living with for years or decades?
Oh, that's a lot of questions in a
Yes.
question. I'm not a futurist, and I don't have a good sense of, I've read pieces about, we're all going to want to work at home forever. We're all going to rush back to the office because we're so lonely. I'm not certain which one is going to prevail. I know, how I feel about my situation, but I don't know how that's going to work out. I do think virtual meetings make a lot more sense in some cases and probably not in others. And I suspect, going forward, I would be surprised that if they would disappear. In terms of your question about, is this something we're going to have to live with forever? You're talking about the virus and sort of living in an acute COVID outbreak situation. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or something more than a mild COVID outbreak where it is continuously circulating, and there might be periods where more stringent containment measures are recommended or less, but that it's not something that we're going to be able to eradicate or move past.
So I don't think that, I think that, the door on eradication has been shut for a long, long time. All of the experts I talked to think this is going to be an endemic human coronavirus. We had 4 before this. We have 5 now. The human coronaviruses are one of the causes of common colds. You catch them mostly in childhood, and they don't really bother you in adulthood, except sort of at the end of the life spectrum. So that U-shaped curve type of thing. Right. Again, the people that I speak to have talked about reaching a point where we reach a detente with the virus. We have enough immunity on board as a population that it can't collapse healthcare systems in the way that it currently does, which doesn't mean that you might not have some flare-ups at times, and depending on how quickly the virus surface protein changes, I guess there's a potential. I don't think it's as high as it is with flu, but there's a potential that evolution of the virus could cause some problems. I guess the big question is, how long does it take for us to have enough protection that this becomes just something that hits in the winter and becomes, source of a influenza-like illness type of thing.
Not essentially not getting to herd immunity, but getting to like a herd-light immunity, where in places where, in seasons where people are more likely to encounter each other indoors, you might have more transmission. Yeah,
I've always said that, not always, but for a long time, I'm not sure herd immunity is the right term to be using in this circumstance.
Right.
I mean, herd immunity implies that you can get it under control and keep it from spreading in the way that, a well-vaccinated population keeps measles from spreading. I don't know that that's what we're looking at. I think, this bug is here to stay and is going to be part of the swarm of things that we have to deal with every winter, but that it won't be as big a threat to us in a few years. And I don't know how soon that is than it is right now.
Right. I do have some more questions, but we have a bunch of audience questions coming in, so I'm going to shift over to them. One question that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds is that the coverage of COVID and the public response to COVID has been so radically affected by misinformation. And at this point, it seems like misinformation is probably as much of a hindrance in fighting the virus as lack of preparedness or anything else. You know, in the massive numbers of people in this country and around the world who are refusing to be vaccinated. What do you do you see a way that science reporters can combat that in a way that might make a difference, or is that sort of you know, trying to stop a flood with a Band-Aid?
I'm not certain. It's something that, you know, I struggle with. I think most science reporters probably struggle with, you know, trying to hit the balance between, when you're faced with something like ivermectin, how many stories about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or whatever do you want to write?
About fake cure, about these bogus.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. You know, on the one hand, trying to sort of debunk something may debunk it for some people, but it gives more oxygen to something, and it's just really a hard, you know, balance to strike. And I'm not sure I've ever felt like we as a profession have hit it, you know, appropriately. Yeah, it is startling and disconcerting, you know, especially given that so much of it is, at least in this country, is sort of steeped in politics, you know, that, and so, you know, I could write a piece debunking something, but whether or not the people who need to read it are going to read stat, I don't know, you know.
Yeah, right. And whether the people who read it, if they did read stat, I mean, you know, one of the challenges of misinformation is that once someone believes in a conspiracy, evidence showing that it is not actually true actually only reinforces their belief in a conspiracy. Whether they're reading stat because they want to learn other perspectives, or whether they're reading stat and viewing that as more evidence for their cause. Another question from the audience is that on a story like this, which is the biggest story in every local market and every national and international market, and has been for well over a year, how do you make your reporting stand out? How do you make sure that you're doing stories that are adding to the conversation and are just not just one more story about a similar topic that everyone else is writing about?
Well, I'm in a kind of privileged position as a journalist. You know, I work for an outlet that isn't trying to chase mostly the same story that everybody else is chasing. You know, I have, you know, my marching orders from my editors are that, you know, I can mostly, not always, focus on things that you know, I don't have to try to match every story, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So that's a luxury. That's not a, you know, a situation that all journalists, or even maybe most science journalists, face, especially if they're working like at a newspaper. Although freelancers obviously would have to find stories that were sufficiently different. I don't know.
Yeah,
I kind of feel like it comes with the beat. I mean, the more people you talk to, the more things you stumble over. You know, you're writing about X, and somebody that you're speaking to mentions Y, and it's like, oh, I'm not sure I would have thought to go there, but that sounds interesting, and you explore that. Right.
This is a little bit in the weeds, but I think probably very appropriate to the audience. And the question is, what do you think about the way that companies now are releasing COVID vaccine and treatment related data and information via press release, as opposed to before publication or before submission to the FDA. Yeah, there's a follow-up, but what do you think about that? What's your view of that?
So I kind of hate it, but I'm not a business reporter. And, my business reporter colleague, Matt Harper, would say they have a duty to, when they have data that could move stock prices, that they have a duty to report to their shareholders. The thing is, we're not living in a world where you can sequester that information somewhere, so I don't like it. You end up with a situation where somebody says our data say X, but nobody can kick the tires for another few weeks, and the stock soars. But meanwhile, everybody's waiting to find out if that's spin or if that's real.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that Matt says that. Matt's someone who I admire and respect enormously, and vehemently disagree with him on that. I think that there is certainly a way that you could view dealing with something and making sure that it can be verifiable as simultaneously their scientific responsibility and their fiduciary responsibility. Yeah. That releasing something before it has been vetted by the outside world, you run the risk of enormous spikes and craters in something like stock price.
Yeah, that happened with the Moderna vaccine early on.
Yeah. Okay, another question. And actually, I'm going to throw in kind of one of my questions with this too. But in covering infectious diseases and global health, you're dealing with so many kind of horrific tragedies and stories of incredible loss and pain. How do you avoid becoming desensitized to that? And a sort of question alongside that is, I found just living through the last 19, 20, whatever months to be incredibly anxiety inducing. And there were times when I had to say, I'm not going to read any more coverage today because I can't handle it. Mm-hmm. What is it like for you who where you don't really have the freedom to say, you know what, enough COVID for the day. I'm going to go watch The Simpsons for 3 hours.
So, the particular lane that I drive in sort of insulates me a little bit. I'm not writing stories. Like, I wasn't going into or trying to get into like a COVID ward and write about what was happening there. We did have, one of my colleagues was doing that kind of work, and I think that would be tough to do a lot of. My reporting deals more with sort of scientists and data, and so that's not as agonizing on an ongoing basis.
Right.
Although the numbers, can really overwhelm you. I, certainly found early on, by early on, I mean, maybe about March or early April, when it was clear that, this had really taken off, and we had no hope of avoiding this bad period of who knew how long. I found it hard. There were times when I remember a few days I really could barely pull myself out of bed. We have a employee assistance program, as a lot of companies do, and they put me together with a therapist, not a psychologist, which
Right.
was really great, because at that point in time, you almost couldn't find a psychologist. They were so overwhelmed. And I, only did a couple of sessions. because I didn't, not because I have anything against therapy. I love therapy, but I just, it was what I needed at that moment,
Right.
you know, sort of to help ground me again. And so, you know, that's what I did. But it is certainly, you know, it's been a long road to hoe. And you know, what else did I do? I turned off my television. You know,
Yeah.
for a while I had the TV, I'm working at home as everybody else is, and I had the TV on to sort of monitor things. And then I was just finding myself hyperventilating. So I
Yeah.
just turned off my television, and that cut me off a bit, which had downsides, but it was what I needed to do.
We are unfortunately going to have to wrap up in a second. There's still a whole slew of questions that we haven't gotten to. I also am noticing now that a bunch of people put questions directly into the chat where I was not seeing them because we were going to the Q&A part. So I'm sorry that I didn't get to those, but we wouldn't have had time to get to everything anyway. Before we have about a minute and a half left, is there anything that you would like to end with? Either, yeah, I'll just leave it like that. Is there anything that you would, this is an audience probably made up disproportionately of journalists, but is there anything you'd like to end with about your experience covering COVID or your experience writing about science more generally?
Well, I would like to end by you know, just making the, you know, to swing back to Sharon for a second, and
Yeah.
and you know, I miss her. I wish she were still around.
Yeah.
We miss her as an organization, and I miss her as a friend. And I miss, you know, the fact that we didn't get to see more of her COVID coverage, because I think it would have been really interesting, and because she always had a different take on things. I remember at a point she came to a story meeting with an idea that she said people are being put on ventilators too soon, and I was like, where did that come from?
Right.
And you know, she'd been talking to a pulmonologist she knew, and he said, you know, they're doing this, and I was like, wow, she could always pull something like that out of her
Right.
hat, and I'm sorry that we're not getting to see her do that.
Right. Right. Yeah, Sharon was certainly extraordinary. I would strongly recommend people checking out her books, but also if you go to statnews.com, STATNEWS.com, you can read all of the work she did for Stat there. And it is an incredible body of work for the 5 or 6 years that she was there. And you can also see the breadth of stories and issues and types of stories that she could cover, and do it all with just so, I guess the biggest compliment I can pay is that her writing always felt effortless to read, which is so incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah.
But
and I think it was for her to do it. I never saw her struggling as she wrote, which I don't understand at all.
I'm sure she, I mean, I'm sure she just her writing was so great that if she wasn't struggling, it would be a dagger through my heart because of how hard it is for me to write a sentence that's like 1/10 as good as what she was able to do. I also want to thank you. For anyone who's not familiar with Helen's work, I would absolutely recommend the same thing, going to Stat and reading her work. I started reading Helen when I first began writing about infectious diseases, and when she was still in Canada, and she was very much like a beacon for me. If I ever was confused about an issue, I could look up her work, and hopefully she had written on that topic, and that would sort things out for me. So again, I would like to thank AAAS and Kavli for sponsoring this. And sponsoring the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards. If you would like more information about those, you can go to SJ Awards. now I need to find my, to make sure I have it right. SJawards.AAAS.org, SJawards.AAAS.org. And if you're interested in learning more about MIT Science Writing Program, go to SciWrite, SCIWRITE.mit.edu. And if you're interested in reading Helen's work or Sharon's work or a whole bunch of other incredibly impressive journalists' work, go to statnews.com. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, and hopefully we will see you again in the future.
Thanks, Seth.
Thanks, Helen.